Hello everyone, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching this video on our leaders, where we will be covering Jair Messias Bolsonaro and Justin Pierre James Trudeau. This happens to be the last episode of this series, Our Leaders, where I've been covering the 50 most important leaders or countries by GDP, heads of state. This happens to be the last. However, a colleague of mine recently talked to me explained to me the term canonical. I had thought canonical. I had thought like Pachelbel's canon, only in a musical sense, but it's a part that is not a part of a series essentially. So, nonetheless, so these videos don't have to be watched in order. So if this is your first, great. If it's your last, which I hope it's not, that's okay too. And if you've seen others as well, that's great as well. So nonetheless, let's begin with Jair Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil. So, Bolsonaro was born on March 21st, 1955, which makes him an Aries. When I think of an Aries, I think of, Mars, the god of war. I don't know too many Aries off the top of my head. I can think of Martin Shkreli in terms of famous people, but maybe it's because not too many let you know as well. That could be part of it. But nonetheless, I think if you believe in astrology, that's important to note. If you don't, toss that information aside. He is a Brazilian politician. He is a retired military officer, serving as the 38th and current president of Brazil since the 1st of January 2019. Thus, he was 64 years old at the time. Yes, he was 64 years old at the time. In 2018, he was elected a member of the Conservative Social Liberal Party, but he has since cut his ties when he became president. In 1991, when he was 31, to 2018, when he was 63, he served in the Chamber of Deputies representing Rio de Janeiro, the state of Rio de Janeiro, very large city. I've actually haven't been there, but it's not the largest in Brazil, which happens to be Sao Paulo, nor is the capital, which happens to be Brasilia. But nonetheless, let's start with his early life. So he was born on the 21st of March, 1955, thus an Aries, once again to mention, in Glacerio, which is about 400 meters high in the city of Sao Paulo, which is the largest city. So case in point, or not case in point, but an important detail, he was born in the largest city in Brazil. It is the largest of the 26 states of Brazil, represents about 21.9% of the country's GDP, and 21.9% of the country's population. However, 39.9% of the GDP. So per capita, they have more GDP as well. Might not be evenly distributed, but nonetheless, it counts for more than its weight in terms of GDP. And it has about 46 million people and is in the southeast of Brazil. And as mentioned, it's not the capital, however, which is Brasilia. He is mostly Italian and has some German heritage, which is interesting because Brazil is predominantly Portuguese, or perhaps the indigenous populations as well, but less likely in the latter case. His father was Percy Geraldo Bolsonaro, and his mother was Olinda Bontier. His paternal grandfather was from Padua, Italy, which is not on the boot part of Italy, it's on the mainland. It might be noted that Rome is on the boot part, kind of in the west, coming on the water, if you've seen my ancient Roman, or Greek and Roman histories in biographies, pardon me. His great-grandfather was spelt Bolsonaro with a Z, but has since been changed to Bolsonaro, as we know today, at least in Jair's case. His maternal grandfather was from Hamburg, however, so getting his Germanic roots as well, and his mother's Tuscan grandparents would often visit him in the 1980s, so not only did he have that Italian roots, but he actually had Italian ancestors coming to visit him in Brazil. Percy, his father, immigrated at 10 years old, so Percy lived in Brazil for most of his life and died in 1955. 1995. So when Jair Bolsonaro was 40 years old. He moved around. Bolsonaro moved around. Jair Bolsonaro and his family moved around Sao Paulo, much moving from Ribeira to Jundiaí to Sete Barras to and finally settling in El Dorado in the south in 1966 when he was 11 years old. And he actually did this all with a family of 5 brothers. I actually couldn't find out if he was the eldest brother, but I feel like it would have specified if he was the eldest brother, so that's an interesting point to note if he is not, because most cases, as we'll see in the case of Justin Trudeau, you don't want to do any comparisons just yet, but he is the eldest son. So, but I'm not saying Jair is not the eldest son. I just cannot confirm. He moved Jair after Sao Paulo. He has a fan of the Palmeiras. He was named after Palmeiras player Jair de Rogo Pinto, who was celebrating his 34th birthday on the day Jair Bolsonaro was born. So he was named after this famous football player, or as they call it in the States, soccer, or Canada. So in terms of his career, his military career, so at the end of his high school in El Dorado, which I think is a cool name because Candide, they looking for El Dorado. He was admitted to Escola Preparatoria de Cantas do Emercito, which is a Brazilian army prep school. He entered in 1973 when he was 18 years old. Then he entered the Academia Militar des Algures Negras, which is the main military academy of Brazil. He graduated in 1977 when he was 22 years old as an artillery officer. So, interesting thing to note here, Napoleon, artillery officer. Any parallels here? I'm not sure. My grandfather on my mother's side was an artillery officer. I don't know. I don't know if I would ever choose artillery officer if I was going into the military service, but I think there is this, but maybe I would not have. But there's certain sophistication that goes along with it. They're not really the ones sent right out directly into battle. They actually are more tactful. So, just another thing to note. He served in the 9th Field Artillery Group in Nicua, a municipality in Mato Grosso do Sul state, which is in the central west of Brazil, so moved away from Sao Paulo to work in a field artillery group. He studied at the Army Physical Training School in Rio de Janeiro, the same city he served, the 21st Field Artillery Group, and also in the 8th Paratrooper Group. So he was a paratrooper, which is actually a very, I think, a daring thing to do in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And he was also in the Field Artillery Group, and he was in the Paratrooper Brigade. So kind of a thrill seeker, it seems. He kind of went to a smaller town for a time, but then he comes back to Rio de Janeiro, which is not the city he's from, and Rio de Janeiro actually has the largest slum in Latin America, but there are slums in the other cities too. But it does have a lot of crime and such. There's like bullet holes all over and stuff, but I don't know. I went into the slum. It didn't seem too bad, but I wasn't there for that long, so it's hard to say. But he kind of a thrill seeker. He was a paratrooper dropping down, but he studied physical training, so a very active guy. He seems very much like a war lover, kind of like an Aries, but not necessarily war. And we could see he might be more peaceful than one might expect, but nonetheless, quite a thrill seeker. Some of his superiors, or some of his peers as well, called him aggressive, has said he had excessive ambition to get financial and economic gain. At one point he tried to mine gold in Bahia State. He said it was a hobby and used for mental hygiene, so he's tried starting a gold mine. In 1987, he studied at the Officers Improvement School, and studying advanced artillery course at 32 years old. So, despite trying to start a mine and being, he still kind of was actually genuinely fascinated, it seemed, in artillery and that sort of thing. And we'll see well, he eventually gets in trouble for even some of this as well. In 1986, he got his first publicity in an interview with Behat newspaper, where he argued about low military salaries and the High Command Office firing officers for budgetary cuts rather than deviations in conduct. So he's saying, firstly, military officers should get more pay, and secondly, when they do get fired, it has been for the wrong reason. So these are pretty aggressive, not aggressive, pretty strong objections he's giving towards the military. So he's from the military caste, he's grown up in the military caste, and he almost has given himself the ability to actually even be able to criticize it, which I think is interesting because he's a lot of in the rise and fall of the Third Reich, for example, Adolf Hitler, he said that the military caste was something on its own that had to be won in addition to the upper and the lower class. So it's kind of like a class of its own. But Bolsonaro isn't really, he's in the military class, but he's kind of above it in the sense that he starts to criticize it, or at least the superiors. So he's kind of a rebel, it seems. He gets reprimanded a few times, but he became a household name for speaking out against the military in a sense. But he got particularly popular among disenfranchised right-wing who were disappointed with the new civilian democratic government. He also, some fellow officers and wives of military started supporting him. So he did start actually getting some support out there. So it's not that he was making this up. There was some support with it. Or maybe it was inception. Maybe he put the idea in their mind. But I think it's kind of both. I think it's... in 1987, they reported with the Army colleague that an Army colleague said he had plans to plant bombs in the military units in Rio de Janeiro. So he's 32 years old, and now the same newspaper is criticizing him of kind of a plot to blow up the military stuff, objects in Rio de Janeiro. So he's kind of like a military Guy Fawkes, but is this true? As we'll see, it's Bolsonaro said it was a fantasy, so maybe it's not true at all. The next issue was they even found sketches of the plans, but it turns out it could have been a frame-up too. There was an investigation, but by the Justification Board, which is the military bureau, which unanimously found him guilty, saying he had a serious personality deviation and a professional deformation. And they said he had a lack of moral courage to leave the army. So the picture they're drawing of him at this point is that he is just kind of a psychopath who wants to leave the army but doesn't, so he's stirring up the pot. But then later, the Supreme Military Command analyzed the case, so kind of like an appellate court, and the general in charge reported that after 9-4 split in vote to acquit Bolsonaro, that 1, he had already been penalized for the former Behat report, 2, there was no testimonial evidence of his plans to plant bombs, and 3, there were deep contradictions in 4 of the geological exams, 2 of which failed to conclude that Bolsonaro had plans. So an issue with the evidence that was brought forward, and a lack of testimony as well, and that this would have also double punished him. So he is found, he is acquitted and gets to walk out. And in 1988, after he was acquitted at 33 years old, he left the army after 15 years, reaching the rank of a captain. So with that, he said he was done with it. So just kind of moved on from the military at that point, but spent a lot of time in it as well. In terms of his political career, in 1988, at 33 years old, he was elected city councilor in Rio de Janeiro for the Christian Democrat Party. his son Flavio was a candidate as well, only to avoid his son Flavio said that he ran as a candidate only to avoid persecution from his superiors. So it's saying that after he was persecuted in the military, he went to become a city councilor to be sort of politically immune. But by chance, he ended up continuing to do this. In the 1990s, he spent 2 years in mainly to give visibility to military cuts and such as retirement benefits for former officers. So he's kind of still keeping his ties to the military class. He's considered at this point to be quiet, discreet, conservative, and showing little participation in the municipal chamber. In 1990, on his 35th year, he was elected federal deputy, which is a congressman or a member of parliament, for the Christian Democrat Party, which he held for 7 consecutive terms from 1991 to 2018, so for 28 years. In 2014, he became a congressman who gained the most votes in Rio de Janeiro at 465,000 votes. So that's no matter how you twist it or tie it, 465,000 people in the city of Rio de Janeiro gave their vote directly to Jair Bolsonaro. He was put in this time. He put a constitutional amendment and 171 bills forward, 2 of which were even passed into law. He claimed that the left-wing party was persecuting, but rather that they would consider his bills because they would vote for who is the author is, not the party. So once again, it's kind of like, although was in the military, he wasn't really a full die-hard military supporter, whereas now he's on the right wing, but he still doesn't believe that he cannot win over the left wing as well. So he seems to like to cross these boundaries. In the Brazilian National Congress, he moved parties. In 2018, he left the Social Christian Party to the Social Liberal Party, which caused the adoption of the conservative and right-wing positions. And social liberal levers were announced as a departure from the PSL, so jumping around parties quite significantly. Then his presidential campaign began. He did go from the military class to city council to the Brazilian National Congress, which we could call like the House of Commons or the Congress. And then he decided to go for a presidential campaign after becoming so popular, getting 2 bills passed into law and even putting forward a constitutional amendment, and he was winning over both left-wing and right-wing supporters. So on July 2018, when he was 63 years old, so he also did significant time in those positions as well, the PSL nominated him for the presidential elections. The Brazilian Labor Renewal also endorsed him at this time too. The coalition name was the Brazil Above Everything and God Above Everyone. So it's also got the religious roots as well. So very pulling from, in many ways, a populist, drawing support from all castes of society. The Superior Electoral Court deferred 2 lawsuits, but however, he was made a candidate in August, despite these ongoing lawsuits. So it seems as though, for example, when he was in the military, he avoided persecution by going into municipal politics. At this time, he has ongoing lawsuits, so he's running to become president. So and these are now being deferred. One could say he's an opportunist only just to avoid persecution, but I think there's more things driving him than that. He announced he was retired as an army general. Antonio Hamilton Morio in 1953 would be his running mate, so pulling from his military background once again, so constantly drawing from all sources. He at this time had a moderated tone at the start of the campaign, but it did, as we see, pick up quite significantly. He was formerly pro the development of policies and ableist policies as well, in however less government intervention. These are his initial party platform. He had a tough stance on crime, traditional family values he supported, and cut taxes across the board, particularly on inheritance and business to spark employment. He had is not specific, however, criticism was that he was not specific despite his presidential platform. He was pro deregulation measures to diminish the government's size and bureaucracy as well. He had a record high crime. At this time, there was record high crime that brought popularity and huge support for his campaign. In October, he announced Paulo Guedes would be Minister of Finance, who is a liberal, so drawing from the left wing again. So always constantly crossing boundaries, it seems. He had interviews and debates on the highest viewed channels, so a great public speaker, it seems, or at least did not take away from his popularity. He was the first in Brazilian history to raise 1 million real, and for the first 59 days, they raised 17,000 real a day. So very, very popular campaign, also financially. The Workers' Party candidate Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was arrested, so he became front runner by quite a strong margin. In the first round, he won 49.2 million votes, or 46% of the popular vote, which is not 50%, versus Haddad, who had 55.13%. He gave a speech after the first. He said he would kill the Reds and the Patrellas, which is a derogatory term for the Workers' Party members. There's also members of social movements. The MST and the MTST would be treated as terrorists as well. So he's very upset, calling a lot of names and using a lot of strong, violent terms to address the winners of the last election. And he said all would go to the edge of the beach, as we can also address the quote shortly, which is an aid that was confirmed reference to the Navy would take base Restinga da Mumbaria, where the dictatorship would take their tortured dissidents to the edge of the beach. So he said he was implying that he would torture these individuals. He was condemned by rivals and journalists and politicians. But, however, in the runoff round, he still won 55.1.3% and became 38th president of Brazil at the start of the 1st of January 2019 before his 64th birthday. So, despite all this, it seemed like all of his violent statements actually paid off because he won in the runout round and became president. He's been criticized since as a fascist for using fascist tactics and spending fake news. He was actually stabbed in the abdomen on September of 2018 during his election. His son was tweeting on this saying, like at first it was okay, but then it got bad and then stabilized. Adelio Bispo de Oliveira said, however, he was on a mission from God and he survived. So very much, once again, drawing from his Christian background as well. He stayed in Rio de Janeiro for the rest of the first round. So after he got stabbed during the presidential election, and he stayed in Rio to heal up. So maybe he could have won in the first round if he wasn't stabbed, but maybe the stabbing actually helped him ultimately win. So it's hard to say, but don't try to get stabbed to win an election. He acted alone, however, during much of this campaign. The former minister made no efforts to resolve the matter about who stabbed him. and thousands protested outside the hospital, not him. So, uh, not very. Lots of people did not like him as much as liked him. Um, but there were also support rallies for him in 16 of the states. So, very divisive figure. In terms of his presidency, nonetheless, which he did win, and there was, considering many of the past elections that we've discussed, there was probably less contested than many, despite a lot of the violent comments that went down and even the stabbing. Um, in terms of his presidency, he succeeded Michel Temer, who is the oldest to hold office, on January 1st, 2019. He started picking cabinet before the inauguration, decreasing it from 50 to 15 from 22, including Liberal Minister of Finance, as mentioned. The, or 15, he decreased it to 15 and then had to raise it to 22, but it had previously been 29. So he is following up on the policy to decrease the size of his government, at least in the sense of the cabinet. 24% decrease. He included women as well, including Teresa Cristina as Minister of Agriculture. He's focused on domestic issues and economy, tax reform, social security, which has been an uphill battle, however, for him in Congress. He's stripped Indigenous Affairs Agency, however, FUNAI, FUNAI, for responsibility to identify and demarcate Indigenous lands. He said they're too tiny to and controlled by NPOs, and this has been criticized as cultural assimilation. So whereas many other leaders have been risen in the ranks through being pro-indigenous rights, Bolsonaro has gone completely the other direction, it seems, at least in this regards. He did not replace the agency, he just stripped it, but it is decreasing the size of government in this sense. The Argentine Mauricio Macri was the first state visit to Brasilia, Argentinian. He supported Guaido as the legitimate ruler of Venezuela, not Maduro Mercy. He is also a Trump supporter. He says, "We will continue doing everything possible to reestablish order and democracy and freedom." Speaking of Venezuela, so despite starting in municipal politics, even he's now going very much into international or foreign affairs at this point. He's been declining in popularity, however, from 36% in 2019. During the COVID-19 pandemic, he's been downplaying it as the flu. He said he would not have to take vaccines and masks. In August 2020, there was a spike, and he was criticized for this. However, in 2021, June, he got a call from the opposition for impeachment for how he had been addressing the COVID-19. There's 45 million for Singapore Bharat Biotech. So in terms of COVID, he offered $45 million to Singapore Bharat Biotech, which is overpaying them for the vaccine, which he was also criticized for as well. His greatest achievement, however, he said, was 2.5 years without corruption. So his biggest criticisms have been most recently related to COVID. However, he thinks, or he's kind of diverted the attention to how he has improved things in terms of corruption. On October of 2021, he called to face criminal charges, including crimes against humanity, for how he addressed COVID-19. In terms of some of his political positions, he's considered a nationalist and populist. The electorate, mainly 343 for working middle to, or usually 34 years and older, working to middle upper class, college educators, some centrists, and Christian right. So drawing mostly from the right, but also center right as well, maybe even some of the left as well. mostly from the southeast, central, west, and south, and they're mostly male and white, however, in terms of his voting demographics. He is pro-life, pro-guns, and pro for self-defense, um, especially in rural areas, he says, and perhaps maybe he's right. He worked in the military in Rio de Janeiro, so he has seen it firsthand, but he was obviously representing one side of it. He's said he's not misogynistic, however, he or homophobic. However, he opposes same-sex marriage. He is not far right. He says he is just right wing. He is against Haiti and Africa and Middle East immigration. Um, he is against drug liberalization. He is against land reforms as well. He is a defender of the military regime, but also, as we've seen, it's a bit more nuanced in that he criticized it as well. He defends the use of torture as a legitimate practice. He is, in terms of the privatization of state-owned companies, but his policies have not shown much economic liberalism. Um, he intends to improve trade ties with the U.S., which he said were destroyed under Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff's governments. He is pro the death penalty, and under his administration, they've which was banned under the Constitution of 1988. So, unlike many states which are trying to get rid of the death penalty, he's trying to reinstate it. He admires Trump and is considered by many to be the Trump of the tropics. His Glenn Greenwald has said he is the most misogynistic, most hated elected official in the democratic world. Augustus Pinochet, he does support, who is or he's been related to Augustus Pinochet, who is a Chilean dictator. His first international trip, however, was to Israel. However, he is very much pro-Israel and anti-Palestine, saying Palestine is not a country. He, however, is a Churchill fan, and he threatened to leave the Paris Agreement during his campaign, which the Paris Agreement was ultimately the United States pulled out of in 2019. There was a destruction of the rainforest was at 80%. So deforestation in the rainforest has greatly spiked under his leadership. But nonetheless, he's, in terms of his personal life, he is a member of the Catholic Church, which is the majority, most common religion in Brazil. And as we've seen, he has been effective in drawing them in. He has a wife, and his wife and one of his children is evangelical. As we saw, the slogan was "God above everything. There is no such thing as a secular state." He's had an evangelical baptism during his campaign as well. He paid maternity. He says paid maternity hurts productivity in the country. He's has decreased the age of sterilization to 21, the legal age for sterilization. He's been married 3 times, first to Rogério Nantes Grua, who had his first son, Flavio, Carlos, and Eduardo, so 3 sons with his first wife, Rogério. Then he married Ana Cristina, who he had a son, Renan, and then he later married Michelle de Paulo Firma in 2007 at 52 years old, who had the daughter Laura with. He hired as secretary, his last wife, Michelle, was hired as secretary in Congress, and she received many unusual promotions, and her salary tripled, so a little bit of nepotism here, but perhaps some people might say it's fine. He was forced to fire her, however, after the Supreme Federal Court ruled nepotism for illegal public administration, so he had to fire his wife. In 2018, since 2018, he's lived with Michelle in Barra de Chihuahua in Rio de Janeiro, which is an upper-class neighborhood representing about 4.7% of the population and 13% of the area. So in a very densely populated city, they account for very much a large area, so a large property in Rio de Janeiro, which is, as we mentioned, neither the capital nor the city he was born. So that is as much as we can cover in a reasonable amount of time on Bolsonaro. In my opinion, the points that need to be painted in order to draw a comparison. Nonetheless, let's go through some of the images here on the PowerPoint. The population of Brazil is 212.6 million, so very large country, not as large as the United States, but very much larger than Canada, we'll see, and very much one of the largest countries in the world. The GDP 1.445 trillion, which makes it also one of the largest countries in the world by GDP. Area 8.515 million kilometers squared, also making it among the largest countries in area. And the capital, Brasilia, which is kind of one of the less populated cities, perhaps in Brazil, but nonetheless a very beautiful city and the capital, nonetheless. In terms of the images, in the top right, we have the coat of arms of Sao Paulo. Below that, we have the coat of arms of his military academy, Academia Militar das Agujas Negras. Below that, we have the coat of arms of Rio de Janeiro, and below that, we have the symbol of his party, the Social Liberal Party. And in terms of our quotes, we have, most congressmen do not vote according to the agenda, but by who the author of the bill is. So as we saw, he didn't count out that he could win left-wing votes, and I think that's been a large part of his success, is that he's been able to reach across broad spectrums of society. These red outlaws will be banned from our homeland. Either they will go overseas or they go to jail. You all go to the edge of the beach. It will be a cleaning never seen in the history of Brazil. So I put this here because this is probably his most bold statement, where he's actually threatening violence and torture to his political opponents, which is obviously very anti-democratic. My government's greatest achievement was 2.5 years without corruption. So that's kind of sums up what his main focus in terms of his government, which as we can see, is really aligned throughout his career in the military. He was addressing crime in Rio de Janeiro, and that's ever since, as president, he's now very tough on crime. And last quote, the Brazilian military dictatorship led to a more sustainable and prosperous Brazil. So in terms of, firstly, he knows his history, but also he is pro the former military dictatorship, and may be foreshadowing that something similar might be in his future, as he is still rather one of the younger leaders that we have covered, so one of the younger leaders of the most powerful countries in the world. So that is my view, or my biography of Bolsonaro. We will get more detail into him and our comparison with Justin Trudeau, the current Prime Minister of Canada. So Justin Trudeau was born on December 25th, 1971, which makes him a Capricorn, but also born on Christmas Day. I once read this SAT article, reading comprehension, and it said that if people born on Christmas are more likely to be deprived of attention because their birthdays are never as celebrated. I was like, it said it is statistically true, or something like that, and I always thought about that, and I thought, oh well, Justin Trudeau has been doing perhaps maybe it might not be as true in Justin Trudeau's case, because as we can see, he is the son of the 15th Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, the eldest son, or the eldest child of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. He's a Canadian politician, former teacher. He's the eldest son of former Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the 23rd and current Prime Minister of Canada, the second youngest Prime Minister of Canada after Joe Clark, who was actually the leader of the opposition against his father. In terms of his early life, on June 23rd, 1971, the Prime Minister's office announced that the Prime Minister's wife of 4 months was due for a baby in December. The Prime Minister's wife was Margaret Sinclair. He was born on Christmas Day in 1971 at 9:27 p.m. I guess if your father's president or Prime Minister, you have all these details are very important, and this was all in the news as well because he was Prime Minister at the time of birth at Ottawa Civic Hospital. He is the second child in Canadian history born while the Prime Minister was in office. The first was Margaret Mary Theodora MacDonald, who was actually the first Prime Minister of Canada. Justin Trudeau's younger brother was also born on Christmas Day 2 years later in 1973. So Margaret Sinclair seems to have a talent for having her children on Christmas Day. And they have a third son, a brother, who, as we'll see, has unfortunately passed away, Michel, born on October 2nd, 1975. So the third was never born on Christmas Day. But they were all born while Pierre Trudeau was Prime Minister. Michel, as we'll see, died at 23 years old from an avalanche in 1998 in the Kokanee Glacier Provincial Park in the Kootenays, BC, when Justin was 27 years old. So the Kootenays, a colleague of mine works in the Kootenays, there was a very big event when Pierre Trudeau's youngest son died in this avalanche. Justin Trudeau was 27, pretty young still, and it was a pretty tragic event. He is predominantly of Scottish descent, however he has some French as well. His paternal grandfather, Charles-Émile Trudeau, was a businessman. His maternal grandfather was a Scottish-born James Sinclair, who is the Minister of Fisheries under Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent. So his mother, Margaret Sinclair's father, was a minister, so also strong political roots on both sides of the family. His maternal great-grandfather, Thomas Bernard, was born in Makassar, Indonesia, and immigrated to Penticton, British Columbia at 15 years old with family. So he has some roots who were born in Indonesia. He's the fifth great-grandson of Major General William Farquhar, who is the leader in founding of Singapore. He also has Malay, Malaysian, Nias, and Indonesian ancestry, as the lattermost case we mentioned. He was baptized on Ottawa's Notre Dame Basilica with his father's niece on January 16 of 1972, which is considered his first public appearance, being the eldest child of the current Prime Minister while in office. In April of 14th, 1972, his parents hosted a gala at the National Arts Center, which Richard Nixon was attending, where he said, I'd like to make a toast to the future Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, in which Pierre Trudeau replied he would hope he would have the grace and skill of the President if he ever should, said Pierre. So Nixon kind of foreshadowing Justin Trudeau winning, and Pierre Trudeau showing his admiration for Richard Nixon. He said he would have Pat Nixon had earlier that day given him a toy Snoopy. Earlier that day, there's a famous picture of that. But later, Nixon released tapes that he was wasting 3 days up there. That trip we needed like a hole on the head. Obviously didn't think too much of it at the time. In terms of his childhood, Justin Trudeau was his parents announced a divorce in May 27, 1977, when he was only 5 years old, and his father was given him primary custody, which is an interesting case. It's usually the mother who gets custody, or half and half. He filed for a no-fault divorce in 1983. However, there was no reconciliation at the time. And in 1983, Pierre Trudeau retired as Prime Minister, and they went into joint custody. His nanny, Diane Loringer, in 1979 said, Justin is mommy's boy, so it's not easy, but children's hurts men very quickly, and they're lucky kids to begin with. So Justin Trudeau did have some hardships, but he's firstly a mommy's boy, so he misses his mother, but he's already got, she says he's lucky to begin with. There's many great things as well in his life, but that does not discount that he has had hardships. In 2009, he said that, reflecting on his parents' divorce, they loved each other incredibly passionately, completely, but there was 30 years between them, and my mom never was an equal partner in what encompassed my father's life, his duty, his country. So there just was a bit of a misalignment in terms of their visions, but they did love each other. He has 3 half-siblings as well, Kyle and Alicia from his mother's remarriage with Fried Kemper, Sarah from his father's relationship with Deborah Coyne. He lived at 24 Sussex Drive, Ottawa, the official residence of the Prime Minister, until 1979 at 8 years old, when his father's government was defeated by Joe Clark, who at the time was the youngest, or is still the youngest Prime Minister. He did not move to Stoneway, which is usually the usual residence of the leader of the opposition, because the property was flooding at the time. Joe Clark permitted them to live instead at the Heritage Lake, the Harrington Lake, which is the Prime Minister's official county retreat, which is they also lived at a vacation with Prime Minister Don Johnson in North Vancouver, as well with his maternal grandparents in North Vancouver. And Pierre stayed as well at Pierre stayed at his friend's apartment in Ottawa. So very much moving around to many different places, but very much privileged, firstly living in the Prime Minister's residence, and even when he grows up, they ended up living at the Prime Minister's summer home for a bit, then spending a little bit of time as well in North Vancouver with his maternal grandparents. He returned to the top floors of the Stoneway to continue school. In 1979, his mother purchased a home on 95 Victoria Street. In 1980, they returned to 24 Sussex with his father's return to Victory, so moving back to the Prime Minister's residence, so living in some very important and beautiful properties. His father wanted him to study at a French lycée, which is like a private school. However, his mother wanted him to get a public school education, so he enrolled in 1976 in a French immersion program at Rockcliffe Park, which is a public school. His mother had attended here while her father was a cabinet minister, so despite being a public school, it's still, pardon me, had some powerful people go through its doors. He was offered to have a limousine drive him to and from school, but instead he drove in the normal school bus, however, followed by an RCMP officer. And he later spent 1 year at a private lycée at Claudel d'Ottawa. In 1984, his father retired and his mother remained. So they remained with their mother and in Ottawa, whereas the children moved to the Cormier House in Montreal with their father to attend the private Jesuit college Jean de Brebeuf, which is formerly a Jesuit private school, which is now non-denominational. So after his father retires from being Prime Minister, his mother stays in Ottawa, and they go back to a private school as his father wanted in Montreal. They enjoyed camping most Justin enjoyed camping most during his childhood. He said, "That is where our father got to be just our father, a dad in the woods," he said in 2009. He said his first paid job was as a counselor at the Algonquin Provincial Park. He has growing up shares of a numbered company with assets about $1.2 million in 2011, where the three sons, or after Michelle had died, or until Michelle had died, receiving 20,000 annually in dividends. So a living wage kind of guaranteed through this corporation. In terms of his education, he after his high school at the private school in Montreal, he got a Bachelor of Arts in Literature at McGill, at which time he met Gerald Butts, who through a friend, Jonathan Ablett, on a debate trip to Princeton, which actually Ted Cruz as well was attending, who is a Canadian senator of Texas. And he became Gerald Butts would later become his principal secretary. Then he went on to receive a Bachelor of Education from the University of British Columbia, which is the province I'm from. He stayed in Vancouver as a substitute teacher for schools including Killarney Secondary, and he worked permanently as a French and math teacher at the private school West Point Grade. So spending time, I think it's an important profession, passing on wisdom to younger individuals. In 2002 to 2004, and it's important to note he's teaching French and math to important subjects, particularly the French in Canada. In 2002 to 2004, when he was 31 to 33 years old, he studied engineering at École Polytechnique de Montréal. He received his master's in environmental geography at McGill, but he withdrew instead to seek public office. So at this point, he really started trying to round out education for a period, studying engineering. So he had been teaching French and math and going into engineering, and then into a bit of environmental geography at McGill, so going into a master's, so kind of moving around, but then deciding to run for public office. In 2000, he attended a summit in Creston, BC to raise funds for Michelle for the avalanche victims. The Creston Valley Advance said an unnamed reporter claimed he was groping her at a music festival, and he had said, "If I had known you, reporter, I would have not have been so forward." They said this may have been late, may have been fake, but just to give this at this time he was being criticized of a sexual scandal, but many consider it not to be true. In 2000, at 28 years old, he became prominent after delivering his father's eulogy at a state funeral. Claude Ryan said who was a leading Quebec politician, said, "Perhaps the first manifestation of a dynasty." CBC in 2003 said it was one of the list of significant events of the last 50 years. So he gives this speech at his father's funeral, and it gets very famous. It's considered one of the most important events, and it gets some really publicity. But once again, a lot of people would not maybe have been able to get this opportunity, but at least he used it well as well. Perhaps his brother, Alexander, could have used the opportunity as well, or perhaps other children of prime ministers could have used that opportunities too. So in 2007, he started in CBC's The Great War as acting as his fifth cousin twice removed, Alexander his brother Alexander has done some acting work. Ben Mulroney and Catherine Clark, also children of prime ministers, also have served in acting parts too. So they have also been in the spotlight. But Justin Trudeau has been the one to become prime minister. So he does have peers, perhaps. He supported the Liberal Party when young under the leader John Turner in 1988. In his 18th year, supporting him in his federal election. So despite even before his teaching career, he was still involved with the Liberal Party and still involved in politics to some extent, pretty much starting in his 18th year in political campaigning. In 1990, in his 19th year, he defended Canadian federalism at College Jean de Brebeuf, which is the private school that his father had sent him to. After his father's death, he became more involved in the Liberal Party throughout the 2000s. He co-hosted a tribute to the outgoing Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who I saw once do a speech with the Olympian Charmaine Crooks, so giving public speaking. So he has been one to really take up all these opportunities, and maybe that's why he keeps getting these opportunities before becoming prime minister. He was appointed the chair of the task force on youth renewal after 2006 federal election defeat. So the Liberal Party was really not doing well at this point. When he was 35 years old, he criticized Michael Ignatieff's Quebec as a nation recognition in 2006. He said it's any support for Quebec nationalism based on smallness of thought and against everything his father stood for. So he really is against any sort of Quebec nationalism or separatism. Furthermore, he endorsed. He's been supported by Gerald Butts ever since. He's in 2007 there were rumors he would run for prime minister at this point in his 36th year in his when he or run as a candidate, pardon me, not for prime minister, run for a member of parliament in Montreal Outremont riding, in which under Stéphane Dion, and would pick a strong individual to run as member of parliament for this riding. He had been the Liberal Party for 26 years, who under senior minister André Roulet, but this region had, Papineau had just been lost to the Bloc Québécois, so they thought Justin Trudeau would be placed in this region. And he won the Liberal nomination on April 29, 2007 with 690 votes to 340 for Mary Dequoy, who was a city councillor, and 220 for Basilio Giordano, who was a local Italian language newspaper writer. In 2008, during the financial crisis, on October 14th, Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister at the time, called an election. And at that time, Trudeau had been campaigning for a year to beat Bloc Québécois Vivienne Barbot in Papineau, as we had mentioned. Edward Greenspan, the editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, said he would be viewed as few other rookie member parliaments are as a potential future prime minister, and scrutinized on that lens through. So it was recognized that he would be getting a lot of scrutiny, and he would be already at this time considered in the lens of a prime minister. And at this point, he became a member of the official the Liberal Party became a member of the official opposition. His first legislative act was as a member of parliament was the creation of a national voluntary service policy for young people. He was the co-chair of the Liberal Party convention in 2009 as the party's critic for multiculturalism and youth. In 2010, he became a critic of youth, citizenship, and immigration. There was a controversy later that he earned $1.3 million in public speaking fees, $277,000 after member of parliament. So he has received at this point $1.3 million in fees, but $277,000 are after becoming a member of parliament. So that's not quite. It's not that much of a contribution. I think what would be a more important metric if it grew substantially, but nonetheless, he has been succeeding financially from this. But I think he would have been succeeding financially from his status in society, regardless. In 2011, he won the Papineau region riding again, and the Liberals fell into a third place in the House of Commons with only 4 seats. So he has one of the 4 seats, and the Liberal Party fell from Leader of the Opposition to third place under the and New Democratic Party. And Justin Trudeau is one of the 4 members of Parliament still holding on to a seat. At this point, Ignatieff resigned, and there were rumors that Justin Trudeau would be running. He said, "I don't feel I should be closing off any options because of the history packaged into my name. A lot of people are turning to me in a way that concerns me, however." So a lot of people at this time, the Liberal Party was really not doing well, are looking to Justin Trudeau. Weeks later, Bob Rae, after Ignatieff resigned, was selected to serve as interim leader of the at the party convention in 2013. So Bob Rae was prime minister for a little bit. I just spoke with him a few days ago. There was a charity boxing match that Justin Trudeau held for a fight for the cure. They could not find a conservative opponent at the time, but through a mutual hairdresser, Stefania Copavia, they asked conservative Senator Patrick Brazia to box Justin Trudeau, in which Justin Trudeau won in the third round, which was considered an upset. But nonetheless, he's trying alternative means of getting attention, but at this time it was still not certain that he would run for prime minister. In 2008, he did not run on Dion's resignation. Ignatieff named would-be Dion leader in December 2008. 2011, after the resignation of Ignatieff, at Wilfrid Laurier University, Justin Trudeau announced he would not run due to his young family. In June 2012, Bob Rae, the frontrunner, also announced he would not run. So at this time, Ignatieff has stepped down. Bob Rae was interim prime minister, and they did not know who would run. But Bob Rae said he would not run either. Justin Trudeau said he would not run because his family was too young. And Justin Trudeau was hit by a tsunami of questions. Polls implied there was a liberal surge from number 2 to even number 2 or number 1 spot in the House of Commons if Justin Trudeau would win. And he said, "I will reconsider and announce by the summer." In September 26th of 2012, he announced he would be the leader of the Liberal Party, who would run, and he would be the front runner as well. But many considered that he might lack substance. His core team was his longtime supporters, including friends in their 30s and 40s, so a younger team, including Gerald Butts, former president of who had been president of the WWF Canada. Alexander, his brother as well, took a break from his documentary work to support his campaign too, so he has really close friends as well too that he brings into his inner circle. He lost the Quebec by-election, saying too much Alberta control. Harvey Locke said he lost, however, Harvey Locke, the member of parliament who lost in Alberta, said he lost it on his own. The Liberal challenger Marc Garneau said he hasn't criticized him for having not enough policy. In 2013, he dropped in pollings after he had been showing failure in this respect. Joyce Murray was, Marc Garneau dropped in pollings as considering contesting Justin Trudeau, so he stepped down. And then Joyce Murray was the last Liberal candidate, challenger, who had accordingly 10.2% of the vote, whereas Justin Trudeau was polling at 80.1% of the vote. He only lost 5 ridings, and all five of which were Joyce Murray's ridings in BC. So slowly, really no competition. Oh, well, not no competition. Just each competition sort of stepped down one after another, and he became the Liberal Party's candidate for prime minister. He said he would pledge to park all assets, excluding his real estate, in a blind trust, which was actually unusual for MPs or even leaders, which he completed in 2013 by the Bank of Montreal, so that has been confirmed. On October 19th, 2015, he had the longest official campaign in over a century. The Liberals won 184 of the 338 seats, so it was successful, or 39.5% of the vote, a strong majority government, which is the second best in the party's history, so a landslide victory from third place to first place. 40 seats in Quebec, which was the most since Pierre Trudeau's near sweep of the province. 150 seat gain was the biggest numerical increase since Confederation, which is the first time it's gone from party's gone from third biggest in the House of Commons to first, so an absolute sweep. In the leaders' debate and televised debates, it said he succeeded over conservative media outlets by using more public speaking, as we saw in the case of Bolsonaro as well. The speech referenced Prime Minister in his victory speech. He referenced Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier's sunny ways, in which he would seek to have new policies that can be a positive force, and sends message to Canadians have sent, and that's the message Canadians have sent to date. He said, "Bring together despite Canadians, despite their differences." So something that kind of paints a picture of Pierre and Justin Trudeau as they're really pro consolidation, particularly of against Quebec leaving Canada. In terms of his actual policies as Prime Minister, which has served him since from 2019 till present, from his 43rd becoming president in his 43rd year, 44th year, but he was 43 when he became Prime Minister. His first legislative priority, sworn in by the Governor General David Johnston on November 4th, 2015, his first legislative policy was to lower taxes for middle-income Canadians and raise taxes for the top 1% income earners, so income redistribution. He's also had a statement promising to rebuild relations with Indigenous peoples in Canada and run an open, ethical, and transparent government. There's been many critics of these policies, however, many have also supported it. He intends to reinstate mandatory long-form census, or did, which was scrapped in 2010 and became effective in 2016. In July 2019, a group of 20 independent academics published independent academics published an assessment on Justin Trudeau's Liberal government. It said of the 353 promises and mandate for change, he kept 92% of pledges, including complete and partial pledges. So 92% of his promises he went through with, and 53.5% of campaign promises. So it seems like his campaign promises have changed over time, or he's kind of not succeeded in those. But in general, most of his pledges have came true. He intended to reduce debt to GDP every year until 2020. He had succeeded in this until the COVID-19 pandemic hit. However, he did not balance the budget in the first term as he had said he would. He's had progressive advocacy for feminist and abortion rights. So the government had introduced a bill making conversion therapies illegal. He has legalized marijuana. In 2016, he introduced the right to medically assisted death, which is a very controversial policy, but I think is fair. In 2021, he introduced a plan to decrease daycare from $10 a day within 5 years. Some people are very against that. They think it's unfair because it disincentivizes work or such like that, or it's unfair to there's various arguments. I know it would he endeavors to decrease emissions by 30% by 2030 and 100% by 2050. In terms of foreign policy, he had good relations with Obama, despite the later Obama rejecting the Keystone pipeline, which Justin Trudeau had been pushing for. Canada had accepted 25,000 Syrian refugees welcomed in the country. He has not had the best relations with Donald Trump. For example, the NAFTA agreement has been replaced by the USMCA. There's been increased U.S. imports of milk and tariffs both ways on steel, aluminum, and a variety of other products. His stance on China has been quite nuanced. For example, the Wang Wangzhou case, where she was held in Vancouver, and respectively 2 Michaels were held in China as 2 hostages, essentially on both sides, both in house arrest on one in Canada, but in prison in the other. They had a second failure to win a UN Security Council seat in 2020, which I don't think is entirely his fault, but he could have prioritized it more. There's the SNC Lavalin scandal where he had been putting pressure on Jody Wilson-Raybould, as many say, among other issues with this. In 2019, however, he won again after he called an election, so he maintained his seat as prime minister. However, he lost 20 seats in this election. There was at this time also a brown-face scandal, so he was in a party, it looked like, for Arabian Nights, and he painted his face brown, which was considered racist by many. He's been criticized for going on trips to visit his family friend Aga Khan on his private island. He created an indigenous day, but then was not at an important indigenous site in Kamloops. Instead, he was in Victoria. He's been criticized because many of his family members have received $300,000, including his mother, brother, and wife, for giving speeches on We Day, Me to We, which is a charity. In 2021, he won a few more seats. However, he called another election, and people thought he was a bad idea, but he did win a few more seats, winning him prime ministership for another 4 years. There's been many pipeline protests, particularly in support of indigenous groups, where he did not. Some people said he should have called in the military to remove them, and some said he should not have. But he, up to debate, as well as the convoy movement towards Ottawa, where there's a lot of truckers protesting, should he use military action or not. Too late to say and too early to say, but nonetheless very controversial topics. In terms of his personal life, he met Sophie Gregoire as children when they were growing up in Montreal. She was a friend of Michel for 4 years, being thus they are 4 years younger. She was born on April 3rd. They met again in 2003, and they were 32 years old, and she was 28 years old, and she was a Quebec television personality, and they were co-hosts as a charity ball. So kind of met this girl when he was young, a friend of his brother, 4 years younger, his brother, who passed away, and then they meet many years later when Justin Trudeau is 32 and she was 28. They began dating a few months later, and in October 2004 they got engaged at 33 years old, and she was 29 years old. In May 2005 they were married at 34 and 30 years old respectively. They have since had 3 children: Xavier, born in 2007, Ella Grace, born in 2009, and Hadrian, born in 2014. They moved from Côte de Negre, Montreal in 2013 to when he became leader of the Liberals, and they rented an apartment in Ottawa and Rockcliffe Park, and they lived near where his father was, and he was prime minister. In 2014, there was a break-in at this property, threatening note, but there was no damage or anything stolen. In 2015, he had an electoral victory, and he lived at Rideau Cottage. That's also where he did his later did his COVID quarantine. Both Justin Trudeau and Sophie Trudeau have had COVID-19. In terms of religion, Pierre was a devout Catholic, Justin's father. However, his mother is an Anglican, but later became Catholic after their wedding. At 18, he became what's called a lapsed Catholic, doing much of the day-to-day life not addressed, because he said much of his day-to-day life was not addressed by formality and structure of the church. And like so many Catholics across the country, I said, I'm a Catholic, I'm of faith, but I'm just not really going to go to church. Maybe on Easter, maybe midnight mass on Christmas. So I'm Christian and Catholic, but not too strong of one, or at least not too doesn't do too much of the traditional, or doesn't go to church as often. After Michel's death in 1998, 27 years old, he was persuaded to participate in an Alpha course to regain his faith. He said, my own personal faith is an extremely important part of who I am and the values I lead with. So it has been very important to him, and it has been since more important since the death of his younger brother, Michel. So that is the life of Justin Trudeau as we know it today, or at least as I know it today. Each of these details, as with all these leaders, could go in. There could be books on each. For example, SNC-Lavalin case alone maybe could be worthy of a book. But what I'm trying to capture here is the essence of the leaders and draw comparisons from them. So, nonetheless, here is the images here. Population of Canada, 38.0 million, so much smaller than Brazil in population. But GDP, 1.643 trillion, makes it a comparable to Brazil. In terms of area, 9.985 million kilometers squared, one of the largest in the world, but Brazil actually makes it a formidable comparison here. And the capital is Ottawa, which is not the largest city, which is Toronto. Other large cities are Montreal or Vancouver. In terms of the images, we have in the top right the symbol of Ottawa, the coat of arms of Ottawa. Below that, we have the coat of arms of Montreal. Could have also added the coat of arms of Vancouver here too, but he was born in Ottawa, and he went to boarding school in Montreal, or his father spent a lot of time there as well too. We have the symbol below that of McGill University, where he did his Bachelor of Arts, and below that the University of British Columbia, where he did his Bachelor of Education. And next to that we have the symbol of the Liberal Party, which he has been faithful to his whole career, and as his father was as well. And the quotes, at one point people are going to have to realize that maybe I know what I'm doing. So this has kind of been a really characteristic of his time as Prime Minister. He's kind of got to prove himself that he does know what he's doing, despite being younger perhaps, or despite his father being former Prime Minister. Quebec nationalism is an old idea from the 19th century based on smallness of thought. It is against everything my father ever believed, so against Quebec nationalism, but also one of his early political statements, and also showing that he draws a lot of his ideologies from his father. I don't feel I should be closing off any options because of my history packaged into my name. A lot of people are turning to me in that way. To be blunt, concerns me. So here showing that this is kind of the turning point in his career when he was deciding whether or not he should become run for Prime Minister. He recognizes where he comes from, but also recognizes that it has to be his own decision, not can't be forced to do it, anything of that sort. And lastly, my father raised us to step towards rather than step trouble rather than step away from it. So this is something that his father definitely did, and something that I hope he is doing too, and I think in many senses he is. So that is the life of Justin Trudeau. In terms of, now let's move to the comparison, which is in the spirit of Plutarch's Lives at the end of each two lines, one from Greece, one from Rome. I have a series on this as well. It creates a comparison at the end, often very short, sometimes long, sometimes the comparisons aren't even that good. The point is that that's how you get the distillation of the leadership characteristics. So nonetheless, Bolsonaro and Trudeau, first quick comparisons, both their first names start with J. There's I think in word justice, I think Jesus, I think it's a very, I think it's a word of sacrifice maybe. Julius, I think a very powerful letter. Nonetheless, how much does that influence them? Hard to say. Jair is also named after a football player, but a difference, however, is Jair is a Aries, and Justin is a Capricorn. One was born in 1955, the other in 1971. So one is 66 years old, turning 67, and the other is 51 years old, turning 52 years old. So quite a big age gap, about 14 years, 15 years even. One was born in Sao Paulo, which is the largest city in Brazil, but moved around since, whereas Justin Trudeau was born in the capital to the Prime Minister. In terms of both their family, Justin Trudeau has 2 brothers, whereas Bolsonaro has 5 brothers, and it's not even clear to me if he is the eldest either. in terms of their pre-political background. One was from the military before going into into government, and the other was in education, and a bit in personal education and the education of others. Both of them have been famous, but also infamous very much at times, both very much quite populous as well. Um, they have varying opinions on Donald Trump in terms of foreign affairs. Bolsonaro does like Donald Trump, but Justin Trudeau has had a more difficult time with him. But he is neither not president anymore, but a difference in that sense. Bolsonaro is more conservative. Justin Trudeau is more liberal. But both also draw from both sides of the spectrum and also from other sects of society, including religions, groups, as well as the militaries. In terms of children, Bolsonaro has 5 children with 3 wives, whereas Justin Trudeau has 3 children with just 1 wife, so different, quite a different personal life as well. So that is the life of Jair Messias Bolsonaro and Justin Pierre James Trudeau. This is the last video of the series, so I really appreciate you watching this. Yeah, thank you very much.